Hey, it's Deanna. Before we get started, you should know that we recorded this episode before Super Typhoon Ragasa hit Taiwan last week. Our guests do briefly discuss how civilian resilience can be helpful in natural disasters, but the focus of this conversation is resilience to aggression by China, not natural disasters. Also, we recorded before the recent executive order authorizing the use of Department of War as a secondary name for the U.S. Department of Defense. So if you hear Department of Defense on this episode, but not Department of War, that's why. Okay, here's the show. You're listening to Policy Minded, a podcast by RAND. I'm Deanna Lee. Taiwan faces an existential threat from China. Is the island prepared for an active war by Beijing? RAND researchers Marta Kepe and Scott Harold tackled this question in a recent study, looking closely at Taiwan's civilian resilience. Their research included interviews with dozens of government officials, civic leaders, and other experts from Taiwan, the US, and Europe. We're happy to have Marta and Scott here with us today to discuss their findings. Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
Marta, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, let's hear from each of you a little bit about what brought you to RAND and why you study this topic.
I started studying the intersection of civilian and military capabilities about 8 or 9 years ago. And it started really with the fact that there was a lot of interest in the defense of the Baltic states, which is where I am from originally. So I was really inspired by my own experience. I, as a child, experienced firsthand the Baltic Way, the Singing Revolution, and also the barricades. So these were key events in the history of Latvia as it was regaining its independence. And it served as a personal but also professional inspiration, then continue to look into how civilians support or can support national defense and security, not only in the Baltic states, but also elsewhere. So since then, I worked on the Baltics, I worked on Nordics and many other case studies. And most recently, me and Scott Harold, we co-authored the report in Taiwan.
Scott?
Yeah, so I have had the privilege to learn Chinese and spend my life working on the study of China and East Asia. I started learning Chinese when I was 12 in the late 80s. Traveled to Taiwan first in 2000 and kind of fell in love with it and have been going back ever since. Of course, this is widely regarded as the pacing scenario for the Department of Defense. The risk of a China attack on Taiwan is a critical question for U.S., Indo-Pacific, and global security. And it's also a topic I've had the opportunity to teach on at Georgetown and at Columbia University and here at RAND. So it's something I'm quite passionate about and have been working on for a long time. And I'm grateful to Marta for giving me the chance to work with her on this specific angle of the topic.
Before we dive into the findings from the research we're going to discuss today, let's take a step back and talk about the situation between Taiwan and China. How would you describe cross-strait relations in recent years? What's the status?
So I'll handle that one as the regional specialist, and Marta's kind of the functional expert. So in 2016, Taiwan elected the Democratic Progressive Party, a party that does not necessarily share China's view that Taiwan is part of China. The Democratic Progressive Party's view is that Taiwan has its own history, its own language, and its own separate political system that China does not have a right to claim and to absorb coercively or even through outright use of force. Since that time, China has sought to put enormous pressure on Taiwan, stripping away about a third of its diplomatic partners, reducing that number down to around 12 countries around the world today that formally extend diplomatic recognition to Taiwan as the Republic of China, which is its historical name as the Nationalist Party came over from China to Taiwan in 1947 and carried forward that legacy. However, later Taiwan democratized and the Democratic Progressive Party took power in 2000 to 2008 and again since 2016. Because of that difference of opinion about whether or not Taiwan's identity should matter for China's claims to it, China refuses to engage with the DPP administration. And the DPP was reelected for a third term in 2024 under a new president, William Lai. China has put more and more pressure on Taiwan over the last decade, and as a consequence, Taiwan, seeing what is happening in Eastern Europe and recognizing that China's pressure campaign is getting stronger and stronger, has begun making preparations to strengthen its own ability to resist, including its ability to resist through societal resilience, which is something that Marta can talk to.
Go ahead, Marta.
So let me situate this conversation within the national resilience building landscape. So we are at a time when many countries, mostly the frontline countries in Europe, have adapted or are modernizing their comprehensive or whole of societal approach to national defense and security. Civilian capabilities lie at the heart of this whole of societal approach to national defense, and building them requires peacetime preparations. So examples of these countries include Finland, Sweden, the 3 Baltic states, for example. Taiwan is therefore not alone in its adaptation of whole of societal resilience, but it is one of the most recent additions to this increasing list of countries that seek to build comprehensive resilience, so resilience that involves all elements of its civil society, not only for natural and man-made hazards, but also for military conflicts, acts of war. It is also quite unique because it is an island nation. The geography makes it quite an unusual example. So while other countries such as Finland, for example, or Israel may have supply chain difficulties because of their geographic location, in the case of Taiwan, the ability for the country to receive aid, to receive resupplies, in the case of a quarantine, blockade, or otherwise undermine supply lines is even more difficult.
And can you tell us a little bit more for our listeners about what a quarantine or a blockade by China actually looks like?
Sure, I can handle that. So the differences between a quarantine and a blockade start with a question of whether or not China is seeking to use what are notionally maritime law enforcement capabilities, like the Coast Guard, the China Coast Guard, or if they are trying to use the People's Liberation Army Navy. So a quarantine works to China's advantage by seeking to suggest that it is simply exercising legal control over access to Taiwan, and it's using its notionally civilian assets, although, to be clear, the China Coast Guard falls under the People's Armed Police and is, in fact, part of the PLA. However, the public reception to that internationally might look like, oh, China is simply worrying about what sorts of assets are going into Taiwan and is seeking to divert those first to a coastal station like Shanghai or another coastal city for inspection. It allows China to engage in what is essentially lawfare, a way to put the onus on the other side to escalate. It would look bad, for example, if Taiwan's military or the U.S. Navy were to fire upon a Chinese Coast Guard vessel. By contrast, a blockade is officially an act of war. It would be executed probably holistically, meaning not only the PLA Navy, but also probably the PLA Air Force, the PLA Army, the PLA Rocket Force. All aspects of China's military would be involved, including probably the China Coast Guard, too. And it would be explicitly designed to prevent anything from going into Taiwan, whereas a quarantine might say, look, you can ship everything through Shanghai, it'll be inspected, and then if there's no weapons or if there's no energy or if there's no other assets that they are looking to prevent from getting into Taiwan, then it's free to go in. So this is kind of a question of whether or not China wants to play a more or less escalatory role. Many observers, including recent RAND studies, have highlighted some of the benefits to China if it were to seek to take an approach based on a quarantine because of the difficulty for the Taiwan government, the United States, and its other allies and partners that care about Taiwan's security in responding in a way that doesn't make it look as if we are the ones escalating.
Okay, you've painted a picture of a blockade scenario and a quarantine scenario, what that might look like. You examined 7 different areas of civilian resilience, correct? Can you just give us a quick overview of what those areas are?
That's right. So we started our study by defining the key elements of national resilience based on how resilience and related national security approaches are treated and conceptualized in such countries of Finland, Sweden, the Baltic states, Israel, but also organizations such as NATO and the EU. So these are organizations and countries that are viewed as leaders in the whole societal approaches to defense. And we also integrated Taiwan's own resilience categories. Our 7 civilian resilience areas are psychological resilience and societal cohesion, health and welfare, critical infrastructure and vital services, continuity of government and governance, transportation and mobility, food and water, and external networks. For the purposes of our work, we applied quite a tightly scoped definition of resilience. So it is understood as civilian society's ability to anticipate, prepare, mitigate, and survive an act of war and build following the end of the hostilities. So for us, civilian resilience is about the population's skills and resources needed to survive a military aggression. And we defined civilian resilience in this manner to understand and analyze Taiwan's preparedness against these acts of war and military threats, but we did not define 1 or 2 specific military scenarios. Why is civilian resilience important? This is about civilian ability to survive, ensure the state continues to function, so the government governs, vital services are still available to those in need, food and water is still available, even if it is rationed. The ongoing war in Ukraine, for example, is a reminder that even when a country is at war, large parts of the country and the population still need to function. People need to go to work, children need to go to school, everyone needs electricity, internet, and roads. In war, civilian resilience is a core component of national security and defense. It may help maintain societal cohesion and morale, reduce civilian suffering, and help with the prioritization of scarce resources between humanitarian efforts and the military defense effort. And it might make the country less susceptible to coercion as a result of the population's suffering. So, peacetime civilian resilience preparations may, in fact, have a deterrent effect, or at least it may help undermine the potential adversary's preparation of the battlefield. And in the case of Taiwan, and I think Scott can also talk more about it, civilian resilience preparations may reduce the threats posed by the PRC. These threats can be gray zone. These threats can be also more overtly military threats. In the end, civilian resilience can offer something very important on a strategic level. They can offer Taiwan's senior decision makers more room for maneuver.
So just to build on those excellent points Marta made, Deanna, I think it's important to say that if we look at the cross-strait situation, it's quite clear that China, which has long practiced a form of narrative warfare and psychological warfare, seeks to convince people in Taiwan and audiences around the world that Taiwan's situation is hopeless, and therefore that China can win without fighting or win at a much lower cost if it can convince the Taiwan population to cave in, quit, capitulate, and even begin working with the Chinese side. And so part of what the whole of societal resilience effort that Taiwan is pursuing is about is trying to instill a sense of hope and confidence in Taiwan society. China wants to have to only fight the Taiwan armed forces and possibly the U.S. military. But if it has to fight Taiwan's 24 million person society, that's a much, much more difficult problem set for them. As we in the United States have seen, even a superpower with the assets the United States brings to bear can be frustrated in its attempt to impose a political solution favorable to it on a country of 24 million, whether Afghanistan or Iraq. Taiwan, also a country with 24 million people roughly, has the ability to resist China much more substantially if it can stockpile food and water, fuel, energy reserves, medical supplies, communications resiliency, and build up its confidence and morale. I think it's important to say one additional word about how we defined resilience, and that is that in this study, we are looking at Taiwan society's ability to survive under Chinese assault. What we did not look at was Taiwan society's ability to actively participate in an armed resistance to Chinese aggression. So, for example, while in Ukraine and elsewhere, you might say that there are efforts to arm society to prepare the battle space for even a possible land invasion, to engage in street-to-street combat. Our study did not look at that. Now, that could conceivably happen in Taiwan, but I think it's important for our listeners to know that Taiwan society does not have widespread possession of personal firearms. So the military in Taiwan, of course, has arms. The police in Taiwan have firearms. Illegal actors like mafia groups and criminal organizations also possess weapons. And then there are a small number of .22 caliber hunting rifles owned by some members of Aboriginal groups. However, other than that, access to firearms is incredibly strictly controlled, and Taiwan civil society groups who are interested in trying to train for how they might contribute to an active military situation, what they might be able to do that could actually affect the outcome of a fight other than simply stockpile food and live, have been undertaking air gun training. But of course, air gun training is quite different than actual combat preparations. You have had small numbers of relatively wealthy and very motivated individuals actually leaving Taiwan to go abroad so that they can train in the use of firearms. But obviously that is not a long-term substantial contribution or a model that could be used. So I just think it's important for our listeners to understand the current state of resilience and then its adjacent term, resistance, in Taiwan and how the prospects for that look based on the absence of widespread firearms.
So you've laid out sort of what successful resilience looks like. Let's talk about what Taiwan is doing well right now and what else they can do, or perhaps what their vulnerabilities are. What are Taiwan's greatest strengths when it comes to civilian resilience?
I'll speak to this, but then I think Marta probably also has a lot to add, including because I think she's been there more recently than I have, maybe even 2 times since we went. First, I think it's important to say that Taiwan's greatest asset is its people. Taiwan's society has endured military dictatorship under the Kuomintang, the nationalist party that came over from China to Taiwan after 1945, and imposed martial law from 1947 to 1987, so 40 years. They have worked together to build an open, inclusive, and democratic rule of law society where, despite political differences, which are often strongly held, Taiwan's institutions of governance are largely resilient. Not perfect, certainly could be even more resilient, however, very strong. Second, I think that you have a very substantial element of Taiwan's civil society that is actively looking at how they can enhance their own readiness for any eventuality. And I think it's important to say that Taiwan's approach to building societal resilience right now has started from the fact that not only is Taiwan menaced by China and the People's Liberation Army, But Taiwan also faces very substantial challenges from Mother Nature, whether in the form of typhoons or earthquakes or pandemics, most of which recently have originated from China, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but the SARS pandemic of the early 2000s. So Taiwan's civil society has begun doing a number of things, including training on weekends and in the evenings for things like how do you stop bleeding in a dangerous situation where someone has been grievously wounded. How can you be more physically ready so that you can carry someone away from the battlefield? How can you recognize different types of infiltration or different types of activities that might be threatening and perhaps report those to the authorities in Taiwan? And build up stockpiles of food and fuel and other necessary items that people will need for daily life. If you want to talk about what are some of the areas where Taiwan has a lot more work to do, and I think it's fair to say that Taiwan does have a lot more work to do. Most countries do. This is an entire, it's every aspect of life that you need to be more resilient for. I think that Taiwan is still in the phase of growing its awareness of this problem and responding to it. Most people, I believe, are still not yet in a place where they have stockpiled substantial food, fuel, nor do they probably have a plan for what do we do if it's not an earthquake or a storm that will blow by in a day or two. What if it is a weeks to months to even conceivably, as the Ukraine example shows, years-long military assault on our society by our powerful neighbor who aspires to absorb us by force? That, I think it's fair to say, Taiwan has a lot of work yet to do. Where Taiwan's greatest challenge lies, I believe we found, although Marta, if I'm missing it, please correct me. I think we found the greatest challenge is that the politics of Taiwan do not yet fully support a kind of cross-party consensus on the importance of national resilience and resilience building. We have seen the parties that lead the legislative assembly characterize efforts to build up national resilience as preparations for the ruling party to declare independence, which might then lead to war. And so they have resisted and criticized and condemned some of the efforts to build resilience. Whereas the ruling party thinks that building resilience is a desperately important issue, they too have only come to that position fairly recently. There were some early steps in the early 2020s, but really it's been since last summer that the government of Taiwan has wholeheartedly embraced and sought to push forward on this. That's only a few of our insights. I'll turn to my co-author now to share some additional thoughts.
So I think Scott already mentioned some of the really important strengths that Taiwan has, right? Active civil society, absolutely an important element. We've learned that also from other case studies from Ukraine, where we really see how important an active, proactive and prepared civil society can be. There are numerous non-government organizations in Taiwan that offer training courses for civilian individuals, for employees of different companies, that work with religious organizations to help people be better prepared, to understand how they can stockpile things at home, but also offer courses starting from first aid to disinformation awareness to more deeper, more extensive first aid and preparedness classes as well. And those training classes are available from children all the way to adults and retired people. Another strength, I actually see that the high-level interest in whole societal resilience that we have in Taiwan is another strength. That is an important building block, and we should not forget that we do need a concentrated, a purposeful effort that is also top-down to make sure that preparedness and resilience-building efforts are planned, are comprehensive, and are well-funded. That is where Taiwan does have problems, and Scott already really talked more detail about the political issues, the politicization of resilience agenda itself. However, we do have two elements. One is the bottom up, and the other one is the top down elements. Now it's time for them to actually meet. Another element that I do want to mention is that despite the fact that Taiwan's diplomatic representation across the world is stunted, it in fact is very, very active in terms of its engagements with other countries. It is actively meeting with experts and practitioners and analysts across the world to learn lessons on resilience and how to do better, what lessons they can learn across the across the 7 resilience areas that we have defined. So it's not just high level resilience building on a national level. It's really going into the details of every aspect. So how do you build food resilience, water storage? How do you do better communications, more redundant communications and critical infrastructure, and also learning lessons on things, for example, like healthcare and medical care in military crises. I think that's a very important aspect. A lot of work is being done there, but what I would like to see is that these lessons are actually trickling to the relevant experts, municipalities, tactical level people who actually work on these issues in Taiwan.
In addition to Taiwan's civil society and the Taiwan government reaching out to learn lessons from abroad, from experiences overseas, it's also important to recognize that Taiwan does enjoy very substantial support from its international diaspora, including Taiwanese communities in the United States and elsewhere in North America, across the Indo-Pacific, in Europe and elsewhere. And those individuals and some of those groups offer Taiwan an opportunity to remain in contact with the world, even in a crisis, and to present Taiwan's voice and opinions and views on what's happening, including if China were to launch some form of aggression against Taiwan, and to get Taiwan's story out there. Taiwan also enjoys substantial support from the United States and a host of other countries, some of which have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, many of which have informal but even more meaningful and substantial contact with Taiwan, and would likely be part of any response to a Chinese assault on the island.
So let's talk a little bit more about the potential role of the U.S. here. There's a lot of discussion about what the United States may or may not do in the event of an attack by China against Taiwan. But what might the U.S. role be specifically as it pertains to civilian resilience and the others in the international community as well?
From my perspective as a resilience analyst, the way I see the U.S. role in terms of Taiwan learning and building its capabilities is very much as a coordinator and as an actor that helps prioritize the lessons and apply, or let's say localize or adjust them to the unique circumstances of Taiwan. Why is that? This answer is actually inspired by my previous work when I did a lot of work on defense sector reform in different countries that were going through active defense and security sector reforms. And what we often see in countries that are trying to build a new institution, change their systems, is that you may get a lot of advice, but sometimes, or actually more often than not, there's a lot of conflicting advice, a lot of conflicting opinions on how things should be set up, how they should be implemented, how they should be funded, who should do what. And that can be counterproductive and, in fact, prevent the development of resilience. So I think the United States is in a good position of, let's say, being an actor that helps figure out which lessons could be applied and how they could, in fact, be merged together for the benefit of what Taiwan is trying to do.
I'll just add to that by saying Taiwan is a rich country, and Taiwan's own senior officials, when we spoke with them, said, look, we're not in a position where we're asking for anything at this time, and we may not ask for anything at any point in time, physical at least. I do think, however, that in talking with them and with others in Taiwan, as well as with experts here in the United States, a few potential areas did emerge where U.S. policymakers and U.S. policy could help affect an outcome where Taiwan becomes even more resilient. So first, we mentioned already the deep societal divisions or deep political divisions. I should say it's deep political divisions. It's not necessarily deep societal divisions. I think there's a difference there. And in fact, we heard that expressly from a number of different interlocutors in Taiwan. The government of the United States, through its unofficial representatives in the American Institute in Taiwan, can provide some measure of political top cover for the government of Taiwan and the opposition parties in Taiwan to come together on this issue by pointing out, as Marta already noted, that this is not a Taiwan-only issue. This is not something Taiwan is doing, if it does do it, that would be provocative or in some way untoward toward the cross-strait relationship. In fact, as Marta noted correctly, and as many of our Taiwan interlocutors saw it also, this is a global trend that many frontline states, whether in Ukraine or the Middle East or elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in Asia, are undertaking to become more resilient and able to resist and determine their own fate, to become more autonomous, to become more capable of ensuring their own security. And so what that means in terms of specifics could be additional public presentations by the AIT representative in Taipei to Taiwan's media about the importance in the U.S. view of cross-party cooperation on societal resilience. It could mean arranging additional contacts for Taiwan officials with their foreign counterparts, perhaps through the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, which is a framework that the U.S. uses to engage with Taiwan and other countries, including Canada, Australia, Japan, and others. It could mean arranging additional venues, such as in Europe or in Hawaii, where we have already seen the U.S. Department of Defense arrange conferences focused on the issue of societal resilience that we have invited Taiwan officials to participate in so that they can help sensitize European friends and partners to the challenges Taiwan faces and help provide Taiwan with access to the insights that European actors have generated through their own preparations for these threats. And finally, it could conceivably at some point down the road require the United States to help Taiwan access some degree of technology in a couple of key areas. One is the ability to monitor, defend, and repair submarine cables that carry most of the bulk communications from Taiwan to the world and from the world to Taiwan. And second, to help Taiwan acquire some technology solutions for low Earth orbit satellite infrastructure so as to maintain connected to the world through satellite communications in a crisis. At present, Starlink is not a provider to the government of Taiwan. Taiwan has used a British company, but the number of satellites they are looking at fielding is probably vulnerable to Chinese disruption and may not be sufficient for Taiwan's needs. So some officials we talked to said, look, not now, but at some point in the future, we might welcome assistance trying to get our arms around that particular dimension of the problem.
You mentioned that these efforts would not be seen as provocative.
When I said that the U.S. could provide political top cover to Taiwan's government and its opposition parties so that preparations for societal resilience would not be seen as provocative, what I mean is that so that actors inside Taiwan's polity, inside Taiwan's society, understand that they have a right to stockpile food, fuel, medical equipment, and that it is not provocative. Another interpretation of that would be to say, are you saying that China will not see it as provocative? And I think it's important for our listeners to be clear. China will characterize anything that complicates its ability to coerce Taiwan and compel its unification on terms set by Beijing as provocative. That doesn't mean that the rest of us need to accept Beijing's characterization, but there's nothing the United States can do vis-a-vis Taiwan apart from abandon it and help China conquer it, that China will not characterize as provocative. And we should not allow China to in any way define the mental parameters of our policy space by worrying about whether China will regard it as provocative. And that's not to say we should have zero concern for China's reaction to certain things. There are certainly steps the United States policymakers could take that would actually be more or less provocative. This falls on the low end of the spectrum. In other words, if the United States helps Taiwan stockpile fuel or food, that's not a casus belli. That's not going to be something that China says, well, that's it, we're launching a war.
Sure. So the risk of antagonizing China is always there and something the U.S. is keenly aware of. Okay, let's talk about your primary recommendations from this study. What are the key things that Taiwan can do to further build its resilience?
So as I was thinking about this question, three things came to my mind that Taiwan should really focus on. And at first, they will seem a little bit vague, but let me explain them. These three things are: 1, preparedness mindset; 2, preparedness training; and 3, preparedness capabilities. And we need all of these three things across the 7 functional areas that we define in our work, which are psychological resilience and societal cohesion, health and welfare, critical infrastructure and vital services, continuity of government and governance, transport and mobility, food and water, and external networks. You didn't notice cyber mentioned in any of them because cyber is a cross-cutting issue across all of them. Preparedness mindset is very important. And we could even say that it is at the heart of resilience building, because resilience starts with an individual. Resilience starts with the will and the conviction that you need a change, you need to be more resilient. How can we do that? One is work on the societal cohesion element, on the politicization problem that we already discussed previously. But there are other things that we see that other countries have done. For example, making preparedness fashionable and cool, making it prestigious so that when you're prepared, you get a reward for it. It's a great thing to do or to be. Preparedness building also overlaps with disaster preparedness. Everyone wants better roads. Everyone wants to have drinking water when there's a typhoon or a hurricane. Everyone wants to have pharmaceutical products when they are ill. It's part of resilience building, no matter what the threat is. 2 is preparedness training. Again, cross-cutting across all 7 areas. Taiwan needs to invest in training their civilians, so giving them basic preparedness, survival skills, but also working with the leaders of their private businesses, public institutions to give them crisis management skills. So create an integrated structure where people know what to do, when people know how to guide their families, their employees in the case of a crisis. They know what their role is. And 3 is preparedness capabilities. This is the stuff that we need. These are the shelters that are well designed and prepared for an attack, that are stocked with food, water. These are the energy network repair capabilities. These are the blood supplies. These are the pharmaceutical products and many other materials that you may need to respond to emergencies, to help people, also to make sure that you have food or you can grow food if you need to do so. So this needs both people's will and interest. It needs political support, but it also needs investment. And that investment needs to come both from government funders, but it also needs to come from private and NGOs, because this is really a two-way street, And resilience is a thing that needs to be embedded in absolutely all areas and domains. So these are some of the sort of big, broad topics. There are definitely areas that I would like to focus on, things like energy resilience and communication lines. So it is well known that Taiwan is incredibly dependent on energy imports. That exposes it to, attacks on its energy pipelines. It also exposes it to attacks on its underwater communication lines, right? However, when I talk about energy and communications resilience, I don't only talk about the external networks off island. I also talk about the networks, and in case of energy, for example, storage on the island. Taiwan's energy storage reservoirs and tanks are in fact above ground or often semi-buried, which means that they are exposed to potential air raids or sabotage attempts. So a lot of work needs to be done in terms of hardening Taiwan's infrastructure on land when we want to develop this sort of really resilience and strengths within the island as well. And a couple of other things from my perspective is Taiwan does have a declared very large number of shelters. However, there's a big problem with these shelters. A lot of them are not, in fact, accessible. So you have a sign on the street, here is an air raid shelter, but in fact, you can't even get into it. And many of them are not, in fact, designed for air raids. They're designed for other types of threats and crises. And an additional important aspect is also medical and healthcare issues. So here, Taiwan is already, in fact, working, but more work needs to be done on reducing its dependence on the import of pharmaceutical products and ensuring that it has enough supplies of various medical materials that would be needed in case there's a surge in need. And also issues such as blood supply. We discussed that issue in detail in our report, too.
I'll pick up and make a few additional points if I can. Marta has already covered very well a number of the very granular and specific areas where Taiwan needs to build up stockpiles. And I think she very importantly highlighted the training aspect of that. In other words, just having things but not really knowing what you're going to do in a crisis is probably not enough. One of the things that we heard regularly was that the government of Taiwan doesn't really have a plan for how to incorporate society yet. And I think they're working toward that now. I think we heard it both from the government itself and from actors in Taiwan society, including individuals who said, I may be going to classes and learning about how to, put compression on a wound. I may be training on the weekends to be more physically strong and resilient. I may be interested in learning about how to identify disinformation and keep my community safe. But I don't know how the government plans to incorporate any of the skills I'm acquiring or how the group that I participate in on the weekends might be leveraged or maximally used most efficiently in a crisis. So I think what we're looking at is a situation where the government of Taiwan is evolving towards a more formal plan. Their thinking is unfolding in real time. Taiwan has long had a serious problem with continuity of government, and one of the ways that China might seek to destroy Taiwan's society's ability to survive and be resilient would be if they communicated via China's own messaging to Taiwan that in a crisis or a conflict, that look, either your government has fled or collapsed, or we have killed them, you're leaderless. And so continuity of government and an ability for Taiwan's government to continue messaging Taiwan society that we're still in the fight, we're still with you, we have not fled, we will not flee, we have not died, we are not dead, is probably an issue. Another part of this is working within and across the government. Many ministries who we talked to said, look, we're the ministry of XYZ. Our job is not national defense. Our job has never been to think about how a China attack on our physical ministry building or our ministry personnel or our sector and our issue areas would unfold. We don't have a plan for what we do. We don't have information and intelligence about how China might target a ministry of health, a ministry of the economy, a ministry of transportation. So trying to help sensitize the government of Taiwan's various ministries and departments and agencies to the challenge, the threat, and their role in a response has been an important part of the Taiwan Interagency, led by the National Security Council and the Whole of Society Defense Resilience Committee. And as we know here at RAND, we also learn a lot from playing tabletop exercises, or TTXs. Taiwan's government has held their own tabletop exercises over the last almost 1 year and has begun communicating the lessons that they've found out across the various ministries, departments, and agencies and to Taiwan society, so that as they craft the kind of whole of society defense resilience committee's plans for how they would respond, those plans are effectively and clearly communicated to Taiwan society so that you have a more integrated or whole of nation, whole of society response.
We've covered a lot of ground, and you two, I'm sure, have hit on these points already, but I want to close by asking you what the priority should be for Taiwan. If Taiwan could only do one thing to enhance its resilience, in your view, what should that be?
For me, I can't give you one single thing to work on, but I keep going back to my 3 areas that really make resilience tick: mindset, training, and capabilities. You can only do that much with only one of them. You can't do much with only preparedness mindset if you don't have training, if you don't have capabilities. Capabilities are useless if you don't know or you don't want to do anything with them. So I think this is almost like a step-by-step process, maybe. Preparedness mindset, training capabilities, all in one. That is the thing that Taiwan needs to focus on.
No surprise, you scratch 2 RAND researchers, you find 2 probably, hopefully equally, although Marta's ideas may be even better than mine, but 2 equally intriguing answers. I wouldn't disagree with anything my colleague shared there. I think my answer might be slightly different, though, I would say, and maybe not that different. Awareness of the problem and preparation for it in advance, but also a political consensus that this is, in fact, something that behooves Taiwan society to get after. A house divided against itself cannot stand, I think Lincoln said, and that is certainly China's goal, right? If China can induce doubt in Taiwan society, make members of Taiwan society think, I'm not sure I can trust my neighbor, maybe my neighbor will work for the other side, maybe it is truly hopeless, maybe I should quit or flee or in fact, begin working for China so as to cut a better deal. That will do more to undermine Taiwan's ability to resist than anything China could do in the military domain. On the contrary, if Taiwan's political parties can certainly not set aside their differences, they're going to have different perspectives on a number of issues. But remember that they are all the members of Taiwan's 24 million person society who treasure the way of life that Taiwan enjoys and who do not want to live under a one-party communist dictatorship led by Beijing, where they will be marginal and have no voice. That gives them much more in common with each other than what divides them. And that, I think, would be a useful addition to the very wise recommendations that my colleague made.
I'm glad you returned to this idea of political divisions in Taiwan and how much of a challenge that is. And Marta, earlier you talked about, the top-down versus the bottom-up approach and how important that is for those two to come together. Maybe we haven't talked as much about morale in Taiwan. What is the public sentiment around this idea of resisting China and civilian resilience? Are they broadly on board?
It is my perception that in Taiwan, a key problem is really having a unified understanding of threat. And that is where the problems come from. The understanding of what Taiwan's relations with China should be or could be is different across the society. And that affects how China is perceived. And that also affects how resilience is perceived and to what extent people want or think it's useful to prepare for a potential war or military aggression if your likely adversary is going to be China, right? So that is the problem that they're basically facing. For me, it's quite understandable. I don't actually think that all of the society in any country will ever agree 100% on the threat or how likely it is or what would actually happen. But I think there is value in terms of working with the society to explain what the potential threats could be, what it actually means, but also that, hey, when you do resilience, you don't necessarily need to think about a military invasion. You're building your ability to respond to any kind of problem. It can be a typhoon. It can be another COVID-19 pandemic or something similar. And another thing that I wanted to share is, in fact, throughout my work, I've sort of really learned that you shouldn't underestimate the people, and you should have difficult conversations with them, and don't be afraid to have those conversations with people. There is a big role in resilience for empowering people, but to be empowered through the very practical measures, training, capabilities, they also need to be empowered by knowledge and understanding of what could happen to them, but also understanding what they could do in case something happens. So I think that this knowledge and not being afraid to have difficult conversations is an important aspect.
I'll just add to that excellent response. Look, on Taiwan's morale and will to fight, there's been a lot of surveys on this. I think there is a widely believed but shallowly substantiated belief that Taiwan won't fight, Taiwan doesn't have a will to resist, Taiwan will collapse. And of course, that is a Chinese talking point. China has every interest in conveying to Taiwan society and to the outside world that Taiwan is soft, unprepared, and unwilling to stand up for itself. I think we've seen a lot of research in recent years that have looked at this question through public opinion surveys and have found that actually Taiwan's will to resist, in fact, its will to fight, is much higher than is publicly believed. In fact, higher than 50%. If in some surveys, I think we've seen that Taiwan is in fact more willing to fight than China might even be. Not eager, but certainly not willing to submit. It's also hard to know in advance, right? Like, you're ask me today, what will you do in this situation? Well, it's hypothetical, but once people start to see, holy cow, China just shot a missile into my neighbor's apartment building and there are 20 dead children, things that happen in Ukraine, there is an enormous rally around the flag, like not in my country, I won't go without a fight. And also once a fight starts, there's no getting off the island, right? Like you're there. So either you stay and fight and win, or you stay and fight and die, or you stay and fight and are conquered. There is a reality in Taiwan that there are people who have very substantially different conceptions of Taiwan's identity. There were roughly 2.5 million people who came over from China in 1945 at the end of World War II, or between 1945 and 1949 with the KMT, the Nationalist Party that had been ruling on the mainland, that was defeated by the Communist Party of China and that removed to Taiwan and then ruled Taiwan for the next roughly 55 years as the ruling party, much of that under a military dictatorship. Their narrative was that Taiwan was always part of China, although it had not been incorporated into the Manchu-Qing Empire until the late 19th century, that it must be part of China, and that, of course, they would reclaim the mainland from Taiwan through a glorious return to the mainland. For people who had been living in Taiwan, whose ancestors had been living in Taiwan for hundreds of years or more, this didn't exactly resonate with their experience, right? And those people suffered substantial repression under the KMT. Moreover, many of the descendants of those 2.5 million people who came over in the second half of the 1940s have themselves grown up only on Taiwan. They only know Taiwan. And many of them now, given how long it's been that Taiwan is democratized, have only known a democratic free Taiwan. Not quote unquote free China in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but actually free Taiwan. And so irrespective of what their origins may have been when their family arrived in Taiwan, they have become Taiwanese in a sense, not an ethnic sense, but in a civic nationalist sense, as my friend Michael Cole calls it. And for those people, irrespective of whether they ultimately hope to be independent or they're willing to put it off to some future, depending on the conditions at the time, or they think, if China democratized, we would be happy to unify with China. Nonetheless, they probably do not think that it's acceptable for China to compel Taiwan's unification by force. And there are elements of risk acceptance that associate with this question of how Taiwan should prepare and respond to the threat China faces. For some people, they think, look, if we start preparing to be resilient, maybe that will empower those of our citizens who favor outright independence to say, look, we could withstand a Chinese attack. We should do it. I don't hear members of Taiwan society who say, like, look, once 30% of our populace has enough food and fuel, like, who cares if China shoots missiles at us? We'll just declare independence. I think that's a little overblown. I will say, while we were on the island, we did hear from people who directly said, I believe that I am on a list that China has, that if they land forces and if they conquer Taiwan, I and my family will be taken to the mainland and tried and then either imprisoned for life or tortured or executed. We heard that directly from a person sitting across the table from us. It was quite jarring to realize it, even though you know it intellectually before you go there, if you read the news and you see what China has said. Nonetheless, when someone says to you, I know or I believe that I am one of the people who China wants to kill, torture, imprison, it brings it home. I will say there are some people in Taiwan who think China wouldn't dare attack Taiwan because the United States or the rest of the international community will come to their aid. There are others who would say, well, China, this is China's modality. This is how they rally the public opinion in China. They always talk a big game. They always, seek to bluff, but they haven't attacked in the past, so they're not going to now. These are just different opinions, and people are looking at the same world and seeing some signals and putting them together in a way that leads them to draw different conclusions.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Marta and Scott, thanks for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us, Deanna.
And thanks for listening. You can learn more about the research we discussed on this episode at rand.org/policyminded. This episode was produced by me, Deanna Lee. I recorded it along with Evan Banks, who also edited the episode. RAND's Director of Digital Outreach is Pete Wilmoth. We'll see you next time on Policy Minded. RAND is a nonprofit institution that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis.